the cold wind biting at her. She chose a finally heavy trunk. On 5, to the porch of the dilapidated farmhouse. She was a woman who had walked until her feet bled, carrying the weight of ruined life. And now she stood before a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very Mount Calamad. Crowned. So Thaddeus stood in the doorway, his massive frame blocking the faint golden light from the interior. His eyes hard as flint as looked her up and down. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a hollow, searching appraisal that made Beatrice feel smaller than her size ever suggest. He did not how she had survived of the world, or why she come to this desolate edge of the world. He simply pointed to the overflowing pens of sheep, where the wool was matted with filth and neglect, and he spoke only words that would bind them together. "The sheep are dying for lack hands," he murmured. His voice sounded like gravel grinding against stone. "I can't manage the shearing alone, and the winter will be hard. If you marry me, you will have a roof and food, and I will have a worker who does not complain about the labor." Beatrice stood there, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had come seeking a place to hide, to fade into the landscape, but she had not expected to be bartered for like a common draft horse. But then, truth of her situation was far more complicated than any will imagine. She was not merely a drifter, she was a woman she lived for rides or mice she once possessed. What the townspeople would believe of this marriage would not be the whole story, for they could never understand the desperate hunger for a place to belong that now gnawed at her. Would you have made the same choice if you were standing in her boots, watching your last shred of hope deter, and did not even man know your name? Stay until the end. And please, leave a comment below to share where you are watching from so we can see how far this story travels. Thaddeus stepped aside, his movements stiff and practiced, and gestured toward the kitchen. The air inside smelled of dust, dried herbs, and a deep, pervasive loneliness that felt heavier than the mountain air. Beatrice did not hesitate. She crossed the threshold, the floorboards groaning in protest under her weight. She saw the kitchen table, scarred and stained, and a single chair that looked as though had not been pulled out for a guest in years. It was a home that had forgone how to be lived in, a shell of wood and iron that held no joy. He moved toward the stove, his large, calloused hands deftly stirring a pot of thin stew. Though he did not offer her a bowl, he was a man of long silences, and Beatrice found that she preferred the silence to the pity she had endured in the city. She watched his back, the way his strains against the fabric of his worn, dust-stained shirt, and she wondered if he had ever known a moment of softness in his life. He was a mountain, a man, built for crushing work. Yet his eyes held peculiar, jagged pain that sheds the farm he struggled to keep. Beatrice set her trunk down, the thud resonating through the room, and looked around at the layer of gray dust coating every surface. It was a graveyard of ambition. She took a cloth from her bag, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to wipe the edge of the table. Thaddeus stopped his stirring, his hand hovering in the air as he watched her. He did not say a word, but the tension in his frame shifted. The stillness suddenly charged with an unexpected, nervous energy. He was not used to being perceived, to having his domain altered, no matter how slightly. "You will find the wool shed in a sorry state," he said at last, his voice raspy and low as he finally turned to face her. "The sheep have been tended to as they should. I've stight. But the land is winning the war." Morning arrived with a bruising light that bled through the grimy panes of the window. Beatrice rose before the sun had fully crested the mountain, her bones aching from the cold. She donned her apron, the coarse fabric scratch against her skin, and stepped out in the quiet. The farmhouse was still shrouded in the deep, blue haze of dawn, and for a few precious moments, she stood in the center of the yard, breathing in the scent of pine needles and damp earth. It was a clean scent, untainted by the soot of the city that had coated her lungs for so long. She walked toward the barn, her heavy boots sinking into the soft, uneven mud of the corral. The sheep were already bleating, their voices a discordant chorus of hunger and confusion. Thaddeus was already there, hunched over a water trough, his massive shoulders heaving as he pumped the handle. He did not look up when she approached, though the sudden stiffening of his spine told her he was aware of her presence. He was a creature of intense, focused isolation, and she realized that her marries in this space was an intrusion he had not yet reconciled. "The water is foul," he murmured, his voice lacking the sharp edge of the previous night. He stepped away from the trough, his brow slicked with sweat despite the morning chill. "The pump handle is rusted through. I have been trying to make dough, but it is a losing battle." Beatrice stepped forward, reaching out to touch the metal of the pump. Her hands, though callous from her time as a seamstress, were steady. She felt the vibration of the mechanism. The iron groaned in agony. "It needs oil, and the gasket is likely perished," she said, her voice quiet but firm. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze for the first time with flinching. His eyes were the color of a bruised sky, stormy, dark, and weary. Thaddeus stared at her, his expression unreadable. He had expected her to complain, to ask for creature comforts or a warmer bed. He had not expected her to inspect Chenery with the eye of someone who understood the mechanics of survival. "You have interest in fixing things?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "I have spent my life repairing what others discarded," she replied, picking up a rusted wrench that lay discarded in the dirt. "If we are to survive this season, the farm cannot be a collection of broken parts." As the sun climbed higher, the work became relentless. Beatrice found that her size, which had always been a source of shame in the eyes of the townspeople, gave her a stability that served her well. She had strength in her limbs, a heavy, ground endurance that did not falter as the hour bled together. She shoveled the filth from the pens, her back screaming in protest. Yet she did not stop. Every chore she completed was a testament to her refusal to be broken. When the sun reached its zenith, Thaddeus finally offered her a canteen of water. His hand brushed hers, a fleeting, electric contact that caused him to jerk his away as if burned. He retreated, his face a mask of carefully constructed indifference. But Beatrice caught the way his eyes lingered on her hands, soiled, strong, and capable. He was haunted by something, a ghost that walked beside him in the fields, and she wondered if the misery of this farm was merely a reflection, or sorrow he'd not name. As they stood in the middle of the yard, the sheep settling into a brief, calm, a rider appeared on the ridge of the distant hill. Thaddeus turned sharply, his body shifting into defensive posture that was entirely unnatural. He stood between Beatrice and the approaching figure, his silhouette imposing and lethal. The rider was a messenger from the township, a man who carried a satchel that looked heavy with legal documents. The way Thaddeus's jaw not told Beatrice that the messenger was not bringing good news, and for the first time, she feared that the peace she had found was merely the eye of a coming storm. What could the messenger want with a man who had already lost all something? And would this intrusion force Thaddeus to finally reveal the weight of the secret he carried in his eyes? The rider did not descend the slope with a man bringing news of festival. He moved with a sluggish caution, his horse picking its way through the jagged rocks as if the land itself were an enemy. Thaddeus remained anchored to the spot, his hand resting instinctively on the handle of the skinning knife at his belt. Beatrice moved a half step behind him, her presence unintentional, yet grounding. She watched the way his corded beneath his shirt, a tension that spoke of past skirmishes and unresolved debts. She did know what kind of life had carved such worriness into a man. But she read the posture of someone who expected the world to take from him, never to give. The rider arrived and tossed a thick, weather-beaten envelope toward Thaddeus. He did not speak, merely tipped his hat, a grimace word pity before turning his horse back toward the valley. Thaddeus caught the envelope in his large, scarred hand, his fingers crushing the paper until the seal popped. As he scanned the contents, his face remained a mask of stone, but his breathing grew labored. Each intake of air a ragged raft. "They intend to foreclose," he muttered, the words barely audible over the rustling of the sheep in the nearest pen. He crumbled the paper into ball and shoved it deep into his pocket, his jaw working as if he were grinding teeth against bone. Beatrice did not ask for the details. She saw the way his world was shrinking, the walls of his life closing in with each passing year of drought and misfortune. She walked past him toward the farmhouse, her heart heavy. She knew the flames and everything her, the way the flames had devoured her shop until only ashes remained, the way the community had looked at her with pity, then disdain, then indifference. She would not let this farm become another set of ashes. Inside the kitchen, she lit the single lantern and began to scour the shelves. She found a stack of ledger books pushed in the far corner of a cupboard, buried under pile of moth-eaten blankets. They heavy, filled with meticulous rows of numbers written in a hand that was not Thaddeus's. She opened the first one, her eyes tracing the accounts. There was systematic bleed of funds, a pattern of overcharged supplies and undervalued wool that stretched back 5 years. It was not mere misfortune that had crippled this place. It was a slow, calculated theft. She sat at the table for hours, the lantern oil burning low as she crossed, referenced the market price she remembered from hers in the Sid, Fitzgerald Mags. Weiss. The realization settled over her like a shroud. The local merchant was bleeding him dry, relying on the fact that Thaddeus was too broken by grief to audit his own survival. Beatrice felt a cold fire in her chest. She had been cast aside, treated as an inconvenience. But she was a woman who understood the intricacy of business and the resilience, the spirit that you refused to be extinguished. She heard the heavy tread of boots on the porch and stood up, smoothing her apron. Thaddeus entered, his hair damp from a sudden, light drizzle, his eyes rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had seen his future erased. He stopped when he saw her at the table, the ledgers spread out before her like a map of battlefield. "You should not be at those." His voice flat. He walked over. His presence overwhelmed the small space, and placed a hand on the edge of the table. "They are nothing but reminders of a failure I cannot fix." Beatrice pushed the ledger toward him, her finger pointing to a glaring discrepancy in the shipping costs from 3 years prior. "This is not a failure of the land, Thaddeus. This is a robbery. You have been paying 3 times the cost for feed and supplies, never arrived in the quality promised." He stared at the page, his brow furrowing as he tried to grasp what she was showing him. He had lived in a haze of isolation, trusting the only merchant in the valley, as he lacked the energy to fight the outs world. as the numbers began to make sense. His eyes darted to hers, and, for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than pain. It was a dawning, terrifying hope. He reached out as if to touch the paper, but his hand trembled, and he pulled it back, retreating into the shadows of the room. "If this is true," he whispered, his voice cracking, "then I have been a fool." Beatrice stood and stepped toward him, the distance between them feeling suddenly traversable. "You have been grieving," she corrected softly. "There a difference." He looked at her, truly looking at her, and the weight of her presence seemed to anchor him. He did not move away. In the dim light, the silence of the house felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary waiting to be reclaimed. But as he reached down, his hand hovering near her shoulder, a sudden, sharp pounding erupted at the front door. The sound was urgent, frantic, a signal that whatever peace they had just force that knew exactly by an outside force exactly how much they had left to lose. Who was at the door? And why did the sound of it make Thaddeus turn, his eyes darkening with a memory of a conflict he hoped was buried forever? The rapping at the door was not polite knock of a neighbor. It was rhythmic, insistent, and carried the impatient authority of someone who believed they owned the very ground sat upon. Thaddeus moved with a speed that belied his size, his hand instinctually reaching for the iron bolt, his posture rigid. He did not look at Beatrice, but his warning glance toward the kitchen signaled to remain out of sight. She retreated into the shadows of the pantry, her pulse quickening. She heard the heavy door creak open and the cold, damp air of the evening rush into the room, bringing with it of wet leather and expensive tobacco. "You are late with the quarter tally." Thaddeus, the voice was oily, smooth as polished glass, and dripped with a condescending familiarity that set Beatrice's teeth on edge. "The sheep are diseased, and the winter hit early," Thaddeus replied, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stood in the doorway, a human barrier preventing the visitor from stepping fully into the sanctuary of the home. "Excuses are for men who still have something to lose," the visitor chuckled, a sound void of mirth. "The bank has grown tired of waiting. You know the terms of the agreement. If the wool is not a warehouse by the end of the week, this land passes into other hands, hands that know how to make a profit." Beatrice held her breath, her hand gripping the edge of the wooden shelf until her knuckles turned white. This was the man who'd been bleeding the farm dry, the merchant whose ledger she had scrutinized only moments ago. He stood with the arrogance of a predator who had already tasted the kill. Thaddeus did not back down, but he did not advance. He remained frozen in that posture of pained restraint. "I will have the wool ready," he promised, the words coming out as a strained vow. "See that you do. I would hate for the valley to lose its most reliable, if miserable, landmark." The man turned, his boots clicking sharply against the porch steps as he retreated into the night. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. Thaddeus leaned his forehead against the wood, his shoulders sagging under the invisible world. Beatrice stepped out from the pantry, the lantern light catching the fierce, protective light in her eyes. She did not approach him with pity. She approached him with the clarity of a woman who had fought fires, and survived the ruin. She walked the center of the room and picked up the lantern. "Place it firmly on the table." "He is coming back in 4 days," she stated, her voice steady and devoid of fear. "If we have the wool ready, we must shear the remaining flock now. Not tomorrow, not when the weather clears, but now." Thaddeus turned, his face illuminated by the flickering light. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face as if trying to understand, so composed when he felt his nagrate around her. Cadre disintegrating on. The storm is worsening. The sheep will be huddled in the far canyon. It is a suicide mission to round them up in this light. Then we will carry the light with us, Beatrice replied. Her chin tilted upward with a quiet, stubborn defiance. She moved to hearth and began gathering the dry kindling she had prepared. You have the strength to handle the animals, Thaddeus. I have the capacity to handle the logistics. We are not losing this home to a man who does not even know the name of the earth he claims to own. He stared at her for a long, heavy moment. For the first time, he did not see the drifter he had taken in to satisfy a practical need. He saw a partner, a force of nature as determined as a howling outside. He reached down, his hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before he gripped her shoulder. It was a brief, powerful connection, a silent acknowledgement that the walls he had built were finally cracking. You will need a heavy coat, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a secret shared in the dark. I have my own, she said, turning to fetch her shawl. But as they reached the barn, the wind died down, and a strange, absolute silence upon the valley. Thaddeus stopped abruptly, his body going rigid as he stared in the darkness toward the ridge. Beatrice followed his gaze, and her blood turned to ice. A single, flickering light glowed from the top of the distant peak, a signal fire. It was a sign that some was watching them. And based on the way Thaddeus's tightened on hers, it was a danger he had long feared would eventually find his front door. Who was watching them from the ridge? And did they intend to help the merchant? Or was there an even deeper, more personal ghost hunting Thaddeus in the night? The signal fire on the ridge pulsed like a malevolent eye, casting long, wavering shadows that danced to barred doors. Thaddeus did not move, his grip on Beatrice's hand so tight it bordered on painful. Yet she did not pull away. She could feel the vibration of his heart, a frantic, irregular rhythm that betrayed his outward stillness. This was not a merchant's trick, it was something older, a summons from a life he had tried to bury in miles of wilderness and years of silence. Stay behind me, he breathed, the words barely audible over the sudden, sharp whistle of the rising gale. He released her hand and stepped forward, his silhouette looming large against the storm-tossed landscape. Beatrice ignored the command. She pushed past him, her eyes fixed on the distant, flickering spark. If they are looking for you, they will find you whether I am behind you or in front of you. If we are to lose this place tonight, we will lose it standing together. She saw his jaw tighten, his lips pressing into thin, white line. He wanted to shield her, to shove her into the safety of the barn and lock the doors. But the look in her eyes, a steady, ironed resolve, seemed to stop him. Grunted, a sound of reluctant concession, and gestured for her to stay close as they, toward the sheep pens. The animals were panicked, sensing the change in the air, their bleating muffled by the relentless rain that now began to fall in heavy ice sheets. They worked in a frantic, silent choreography. Thaddeus used his massive, corded strength to wrestle the recalcitrant ewes into the sheltered enclosure, his movements efficient despite the mud that clung to boots and soaked his trousers. Beatrice moved between the shadows, clutching a lantern that fought to lit against the squalls. She was the anchor, the one who calmed the beast with a gentle, humming touch, her large hands surprisingly dexterous as she checked for injuries and organized the pens. Every time the ridge flared, Thaddeus would glance up, his eyes scouring the darkness. Beatrice realized then he was not protecting her from a simple intruder. He was guarding her. Reckoning. The secret he carried was not just one of financial ruin. It was a ghost from his past. Someone who had tracked him, the very edge of the map. "They were my brothers," he muttered. The confession a struggling ram. When the war ended, we were not the same men who left. They wanted to take was not theirs, and I could not stand to watch. I left. But they never stopped looking for their share of the inheritance. The confession hung in the freezing air, heavier than the rain. Beatrice stopped her work, looking at him with eyes that saw past the rugged, bearded exterior to the wounded boy who had fled his own blood to keep his soul intact. She understood the weight of that sacrifice, the lonely road he had walked to maintain his dignity. She reached out, her hand finding the fabric of wet jacket, and gave it a firm, grounded tug. "Then we will show them that they have nothing take here," she said, her voice cutting through the storm with a newfound authority. "We will shear the wool. We will prepare the shipment, and we will face them when they arrive. But we will do it on our terms, not theirs." Thaddeus looked down at her, the rain plastering her hair to her cheeks, her face round and pale in the lantern light. He looked as if we're seeing her for the first time, not as a burden, not as a tool for his farm's salvation, but as a person of terrifying courage. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words were stolen by a sudden, thunderous crash. The barn's heavy sliding door, weakened by rot and years' abuse, buckled inward under the force of the wind and, perhaps, the weight of someone pushing from the outside. As the wood groaned and the interior flooded with the chaotic swirl of the storm, a man stepped into the threshold. He was lean, wiry, and carried a rifle with a casual, predatory grace that chilled Beatrice to the bone. The stranger looked around the barn, his gaze settling on Thaddeus with a slow, serpentine smile. "I told you, brother," the man said, his voice as sharp as a razor, "that you could not hide in the mountains forever." Thaddeus stepped forward, his body shielding Beatrice completely, his fists clenching at his sides. The tension in the barn became a physical weight, thick and suffocating. As the two men locked eyes, Beatrice knew then that the fight for the farm had ended, and the fight for their lives had just begun. But as she watched Thaddeus, she realized that, for the first time, he was not fighting for him. He was fighting for her. The stranger began to raise the rifle, his thumb brushing the hammer back with a metallic click that sounded like the finality of a grave. And in that moment of absolute, heart-stopping terror, Beatrice realized she had one last. Desperate the both, but would it be enough to save them both? The sound of the hammer cocking back was a sharp, final note in the symphony of the storm. Beatrice did not move, but her mind raced, calculating the distance between the stranger and the heavy iron's pitchfork resting against the wall. Thaddeus was a Titan, yet he was unarmed. And his brother, a man who clearly lacked the honor that had defined Thaddeus's exile, was already holding the advantage of steel and malice. The stranger's eye shifted from Thaddeus to Beatrice, and the way he upraised her, with a sneer of amusement, fueled a fire in her belly that was hotter than any rage she had ever known. "You have been busy, brother," the man drawled, his gaze lingering on the piles of wool they had worked so hard to sort. "Keeping a wife to do the scrubbing. I did not think you had it in you to settle down. Or is she merely another piece of property you intend to lose?" Thaddeus's voice was a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the damp air of the barn. "Leave, Silas. This is not the place for you. You have taken enough from me over the years. I have nothing left that belongs to you. Silas laughed. A harsh, grating sound. You have this land. You have the reputation of the man who fled. And soon, you will have nothing at all. He tilted the rifle slightly, gesturing toward Beatrice. I think the lady should be the one to decide if she wants to stay with a man who hides from his own blood. Beatrice stepped out from behind Thaddeus. The move was sudden and deliberate. She stood tall, her large frame filling the space with an expected, quiet presence. She did not look the rifle. She looked directly at Silas. Her eyes steady and devoid of the fear he clearly expected to see. The only thing I see here, Beatrice said, her voice clear and resonant, is a man who is afraid to walk away. You have traveled hundreds of miles to bother a brother, who gave you everything you ever asked for. What does that make you? Silas, does it make you a man of substance? Or just a scavenger who cannot find his own way? The silence that followed was choke on. Silas's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing as he processed the weight of her words. He had expected a cowering woman. He had received a challenge. Thaddeus shifted, his massive hands opening and closing at his sides, his eyes never leaving his brother. He was coiled, a spring ready to snap, and Beatrice knew that if she did not act, the blood that would be shed would be on her conscience. She reached for the lantern, the handle hot against her palm, and moved toward the edge of the stall. We have work to do, Thaddeus. The storm will last forever, and the wool must be ready for the merchant. If your brother wishes to stay and watch us work, he can do so, but he will not interfere with the life we are building here. She turned to felt like walking into fire, and began the pile to fire, and began to pile the fleece in the packing crates. The action was so mundane, so defiantly domestic, that it seemed to stun the room in a different reality. She was essentially saying that their conflict was beneath her, that the survival of the farm mattered more than his petty, ancestral vendettas. Thaddeus, the gambit instantly. He took a slow, measured step toward the crates, his gaze locked with Silas's, daring him to pull the trigger. You heard her, Thaddeus said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. The work continues. You want a fight. Silas, you will have to kill us while we are trying to save our home. Is that the legacy you want? To be the man who murdered his own kin over a patch of dirt? Silas's finger wavered on the trigger. He looked at the barn, at the piles of wool, at the woman who was already organizing the next load with such calm, methodical grace. He was not a hero, but he's a man who understood the value of a prize, and he had come to claim inheritance, not a graveyard. He let out a long, frustrated breath and lowered the rifle, though he did not holster it. You are a fool, Thaddeus, Silas spat, though the bite had left his tone. The merchant will be here in 3 days. When he takes this land, there will be nothing left for you to defend. I will be waiting at the edge of the property. When you lose it all, remember that I offered you a way out. He turned and strode out in the rain, disappearing in the shadows of the hills. The barn door swung on its broken hinge, letting in the cold. But for the first time, it felt like the air was finally breathable. Thaddeus stood still for a long time, his chest heaving, until he finally turned to look at Beatrice. His expression was conflicting emotions, gratitude, shock, and a dawning, terrified vulnerably. He moved toward her. His heavy, mud-caked boots sounded like thunder on the floorboards. And, for the first time, he reached out and took her hands in his. They were shaking, and for the first time in his life, He did not pull away. He looked at her, and in his eyes, Beatrice saw the beginning of something that was more nest than a rifle, a love that had no room for the ghost of his past. "Why?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Why stand between me and a bullet?" Beatrice looked at their joined hands, the callous strength of his meeting the soft, rounded resilience of hers. "Because, Thaddeus," she murmured, "a house is not a kingdom until someone is willing to fight for it. And I am tired of losing things." As they stood there, the storm beginning to wane, a new, heavy silence of fear, one that was not filled with fear, but with the dawn awareness of what to another. Kane. But as Beatrice looked toward the door, she saw a piece of parchment that Silas had dropped in the mud, a legal notice, bearing the bank's seal, but with a signature that made her blood run cold. For it was not the merchant's name, but a name from her own ruined past. Who had orchestrated the foreclosure? And was this just a strange coincidence? Or was her own past reaching out to destroy the only sanctuary she had ever found? Beatrice reached for the scrap of parchment as if it were a coiled snake. Her fingers brushed the damp, trampled paper, and when she lifted it to the lantern light, the breath left her lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. The signature at the bottom of the bank notice was not the local merchant. It was the name of a man she had once trusted, the very man her own heart in the city should put the side over the fired odds that had consumed everything she had built. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. This was not merely a case of a rancher being bled dry by a local shark. It was a larger, more sinister web, and she was, in some impossible way, the thread that had led them to this mountain sanctuary. Thaddeus noticed the change in her immediately. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a sheltering canopy. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low and laced with his adrenaline. He reached the paper, but Beatrice tucked it into her apron pocket, her movements jerky and uncharacteristically frantic. "Nothing," she lied, the word tasting like copper. "Only reminder of the debt we owe. It is a signature I recognize from the town." That all. Thaddeus did not push. He had seen the way her face had drained of color, but he chose to respect the boundary she had suddenly erected. That was the shift in him, the slow, tectonic movement of a man learning that his wife was not just a tool for his survival, but a person with a history as dense and complicated as his own. He walked over to workbench and picked up the shears, his movements heavy and tired. The encounter with Silas had left him hollowed out. But the work remained. The wool had to be processed, the kingdom had to be forged. They worked for hours in a near, total silence that felt different than before. It was no longer the silence of two strangers occupying the same space. It the silence of people, of the topic, the weight of the secrets they held. Beatrice found that her hands moved with a newfound, frantic energy. She processed the wool, sorting the grades, trimming the burrs, her mind racing through the implications of the signature on the paper. If the man who destroyed her life was behind the foreclosure of this farm, then their meeting was not an accident. She had walked straight in a trap, and in doing so, she had dragged Thaddeus in with her. "We will finish this," Thaddeus said, breaking the long quiet as the first light of dawn began to bleed through the cracks in the barn siding. He stopped his work and wiped his brow with the back of his hand, leaving a smear of dirt across his forehead. He looked at her, his eyes unclouded for a moment. "Silas will be back, and the merchant will come to claim the land. Why? We have 2 days. Is enough?" Beatrice looked at the piles of high-quality, hand-sorted wool they had managed to salvage from the storm. It was a significant haul, enough to catch the attention a buyer who dealt in fine materials rather than actually merchant worm who only cared bulk weight. "If we take it the valley market ourselves," she said, her voice finding its steel, "we will cut out the middleman. We will find a buyer who knows the value of this quality. If we have the coin, we can settle the interest for this quarter. It will buy us time." Thaddeus nodded. A slow, deliberate movement. "I have not been to the valley market in 3 years. They look at me as if I a ghost." "Then let them look," replied, stepping toward him. She reached out, her hand lingering on his forearm, the first time she had initiated physical contact that wasn't born of necessity. The muscle beneath her palm was hard, warm, and remarkably alive. "We will not go as ghosts, Thaddeus. We as people who have something to offer. I will mend your shirts. You will shave the beard. We will show them that this farm is not a carcass to be picked clean." He stared down at her, his expression unreadable, but the way his hand shifted to cover hers was tell. He did not pull away. The contact was a bridge, a fragile, trembling connection between two people they were unworthy of anything but cold earth. "The contre works. I do not know how to be anything other than what have been," he whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability that tore at her heart. "Then let me teach you," she murmured. She stood there, feeling the warmth of him radiating into her own weary bones. The secret in her pocket felt like a burning coal. But for this moment, she pushed it aside. She had realized that the primary source of their potential salvation was not the money, but the trust that was slowly hardening between them into something impenetrable. As the sun fully rose, casting golden light to the barn, they heard the distant, rhythmic clatter of hooves on the road below. It was too early the merchant, and too rhythmic for Silas. Thaddeus moved to the door, his hand finding the grip of his heavy knife again. But Beatrice followed, her heart hammering. They looked out to see a carriage stopped at the base of the long, winding drive. It was not a merchant's cart, but a polished, expensive brack carriage, and stepping out from it was a woman in mourning clothes, a figure from Beatrice's past who had come to claim the very thing Beatrice was currently trying to save. Who was this woman? And why did the sight of her make Beatrice realize that her arrival at the farm had not been a random stroke of misfortune, but a desperate, final move, a game she had losing for years? The woman emerging from the carriage was draped in fine, brack silk that looked profoundly out of place against the mud, caked, rugged terrain of the ranch. She moved with a stiff, practiced elegance, her face obscured by a thick, dark veil that fluttered in the morning breeze. Beatrice felt the color drain from her face, her knees turning to water. It was Eleanor, the widow of the man whose dough shop Beatrice had managed, the woman who had blamed her for the blaze that had reduced inheritance and soared cinders. Thaddeus felt Beatrice sway and instinctively caught her, his large arm wrapping around her waist to anchor her. He did not ask what was wrong, though the tension radiating for was palpable. He simply stood, a mountain of silent, immovable protection, watching the woman traverse the uneven ground with a look of visible distaste. "Stay inside," Thaddeus murmured, his voice a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument. He shifted his weight, his broad frame blocking the path as Eleanor approached. Beatrice ignored the order, stepping out from behind him. Her fear was a cold, sharp blade, but she had grown tired of fleeing. She stood on the porch, her pioneer dress simple and coarse, her apron stained with the honest labor of the wool, a stark contrast to the visitor's opulence. "I did not think you would find me here, Eleanor," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor her hands. Eleanor stopped a few yards away, the lace of her veil catching on a stray branch. She lifted the fabric, revealing a face as cold and unyielding as a winter frost. "I did not come to find you, Beatrice. I came to reclaim what is mine. You have a knack for ruining everything you touch, from shops to livelihoods. I heard rumors of a woman hiding in the valley, a woman who possessed the same destructive touch as the girl who burned my future." Thaddeus took a step forward, his shadow engulfing this between the two women. "This woman is my wife," he said, the words ringing out with a finality that made Eleanor blink. "And this farm a place for city ghosts. You have overstepped." Eleanor laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that echoed against the silent hills. "Wife, you married this? A woman with nothing, a drifter who leaves ruin in her wake. You are as pathetic as the stories claimed, Thaddeus. But that does not matter. The one signed by my husband's partner is not just a coincidence. Or I hold the debt. I have held it since the day you stopped paying. I have come to collect, not just in coin, but in property." Beatrice felt the air thin. The midterm loop of the farm's survival had reached a crushing crescendo. It was not the local merchant they were fighting, but the vengeance of a woman who had spent years hunting her down. Eleanor wanted to destroy her, and she was using Thaddeus's home as the executioner's block. "You will not have it," Beatrice stated, her voice gathering strength from the ground beneath her feet. She looked at Thaddeus, then back to the woman. "You seek to punish me for a fire you were insured against, a fire that took my life just as surely as took yours. I am done apologizing for a tragedy I did not cause." Eleanor's expression twisted. She turned to Thaddeus, her gaze filled with a poisonous pity. "You think she is your salvation, but she is the anchor that will drag you under. Ask her, Thaddeus. Ask her why she really left the city. Ask her what she stole before she ran." Thaddeus did not turn to Beatrice. He did not look at her with doubt or fear. He simply took her hand, his palm rough and warm against her own, and squeezed it. A silent, powerful anchor. "I do not care for your accusations, and I do not care for your threats," he said, his voice as steady as the mountain. "Whatever she was before she came to this porch, she is mine now, and this farm is not for sale." Eleanor recoiled, her composure slipping for the first time. The giant man with the haunted eyes, and the woman who had stood the fires, in the woods, she saw that her weapon shame no longer had a target. She turned back toward her carriage, her movements hurried and ungraceful. "The bank will be here on the third day," she called back over her shoulder, her voice shrill. "And when you are cast out into dirt, you will realize that love is a luxury you can afford." As the carriage rumbled away, kicking up clouds of dust, the silence returned. But it was different now. The tension had not dissipated, it had transformed. Beatrice looked at Thaddeus, her heart aching with the weight of his loyalty. He had chosen her over the safety of his own history, but the reality remained. They were still broke, and the shadow of the bank was still looming over them. Thaddeus turned to her, his face softening, his eyes searching hers with a vulnerability that caught her breath. "Was it true?" he asked, not with accusation, but with a quiet, devastated need to know. "Did you steal something? Or was that just the malice of a broken woman?" Beatrice looked in the eyes of the man who had become her world. knowing that the truth she was about to tell would either bind them forever or shatter the fragile kingdom they were just beginning to build. Beatrice drew a ragged breath, the sound swallowed by the vast, uncaring expanse of the prairie. She looked at Thaddeus, his towering frame silhouetted against the unforgiving sun, and saw the ache in his posture, a man who had spent his life being betrayed by the people he trusted. The question hung between them, heavy as a shroud. She could tell him a lie, or she could strip her bare and risk the one thing she had finally come to cherish, his regard. "I did not steal money, Thaddeus," she began, her voice steadying as she wove the words together. "I stole the only thing she had left that truly mattered her silence. When the shop burned, the documents were saved. I realized then the fire was no accident, but a desperate act of arson to collect on a policy that was already failing. I held the papers that prove husband's bankrupt. I did not take her wealth, but I took the proof that could have sent to prison." Thaddeus remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon as he processed the confession. The stillness of the ranch, usually a comfort, felt suffocating. Beatrice waited for the rejection, for the anger to harden his features, but he only shifted his stance, his expression turning inward. "You held a secret that could destroy her," he murmured, his voice devoid of judgment. "You could bargained for your life, for your fortune, yet you ran." "I did not want to live in the shadow of what she had done," Beatrice whispered, the admission aching in her throat. "I just wanted to be away from the ash." Thaddeus turned to her then, his eyes searching hers with a depth that felt like he was looking her very soul. He reached down, not to pull away, but to brush a stray lock of hair from her temple. It was the most intimate gesture he had ever made, a silent acknowledgment of the darkness they both carried. He did not ask why she had chosen his farm of all places, for he realized that perhaps they had both been looking for a path past could not reach them. "We have 2 days," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense rasp. 2 days to turn this wool into the kind of coin that buys our future." The urgency of the moment surged through them, sweeping away the heavy confession. They spent the remainder of the day a frenzy of productivity. They worked in tandem, a rhythm forming between them that spoke of an unspoken, growing understanding. Beatrice sorted the finest fleeces, her hands quick and precise, while Thaddeus hauled the crates to the wagon, his massive strength put to a purpose that mattered. For the first time, the dilapidated farm began to feel like a project, a work in progress, rather than a failing enterprise. As evening fell, they sat on the porch, a loaf of crusty bread and a wedge of hard cheese between them. The stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, a tapestry of cold, distant light. Thaddeus broke the bread and handed her a piece, his fingers lingering against hers. The contact was electric, a reminder of the fragility of their current reality. "If we succeed," he asked, his eyes tracking the movement of a hawk in the distance, "what comes after? Will you return to the life you had, or will you stay?" Beatrice looked at the horizon, where the prairie met the sky in an endless, rolling line. She thought of the loneliness of the city, the cold, uncaring streets, and then she looked at the barn, the house, and the man beside her, a man who'd been shattered by life but remained standing. "I have no life to return to, Thaddeus," she said softly. "This is the part in my life that I have felt as though I am building something belong the dunged on me. I do not wish to be anywhere else." He looked at her, his face illuminated by the rising moon, and the stoic mask he had worn for years finally crumbled. He reached out and took her hand, pulling her toward him. He did not kiss her, but he rested his forehead against hers. Their breathing synchronization. It was an act of profound surrender, a moment where the vulnerability of his heart matched her own. "I have spent so long fearing the future," he breathed, his voice trembling, "that I forgot to live in the present. You have brought a life in this house that I thought had died years ago." The battle for the kingdom had arrived, and as Beatrice watched the torchlights crest the hill, she knew that their grow infection would be titerienited. Gepader. Canter. The torchlight flickered against the low clouds like a swarm of angry wasps. Thaddeus grabbed the rifle, his movements precise and stripped of all hesse. He did not look at the approaching riders with the aimless fear of a man being hunted. He looked them with the focus, chill and calm of a man guarding his threshold. Beatrice stood at his side, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her feet remained firmly planted on the porch. She had spent a lifetime running from the consequences of others' greed, and she was finished with the act. "They are early," she murmured, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "They intend to catch us off guard," Thaddeus replied, his eyes narrowing as he counted against the ridge. "There are 4 of them. They do not want a struggle. They want to intimidate us into abandoning the property before the legal deadline expires. They know that we present the funds at the bank. Their claim is void." The riders slowed as they reached the edge of the corral, their horses prancing and snorting at the scent of the sheep. A man in a dark coat, holding a torch high, spurred his mount forward until he's only a few feet from Thaddeus. "You are in violation of the contract." "Thaddeus," the man called out, his voice sharp and impatient. "The bank has authorized us to secure the premises. Vacate, or we'll be forced to remove you." Thaddeus stood his ground, his silence a physical wall. He did not argue, he simply waited, his presence so absolute that it seemed to pull the oxygen from the air. Beatrice stepped forward, her round face illuminated by the flickering torchlight, her eyes burning with an intelligence that silenced the riders. "The contract states the deadline is sunset on the 3rd day," Beatrice said, her voice clear and carrying over the sound of the wind. "The sun has yet to set. If you attempt to seize this property before that time, you are in breach of the law. I suggest you turn your horses around before you find yourselves in the wrong end of a legal dispute that will ruin your reputation more thoroughly than this land ever could." The leader, but his confidence flickered. He had expected a broken man and a frightened, desperate woman. He had not expected a challenge backed by a cool, legal clarity. "We have orders," he spat, though his hand tightened on his reins. "Then follow them to the letter," Thaddeus added, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate the ground beneath them. "The law is a rigid thing. If you step 1 foot past this fence, you are trespassing on private land. I have nothing left to lose, but have everything to protect. Think carefully about what you are willing to sacrifice for a bank that will not remember your names." Day. The atmosphere had shifted from one of easy conquest to one of high stakes. The leader looked at Thaddeus, then at the barn, then at Beatrice, whose unwavering gaze held no room for retreat. He recognized the look of a person who had already reached the of their tolerance. With a sharp curse, he jerked his horse around. "We will be back at sunset," he shouted back over his shoulder. "And you had better be gone, or will not be so patient." As they galloped away, the darkness seemed to swallow them whole, leaving only the smell of scorched earth and sweat. Thaddeus stood for a long time, the rifle still his grip, his chest heaving. Beatrice stepped toward him, and without a word, He dropped the weapon and pulled her into his arms. He buried his face in her hair, his frame shaking with the remnants of his strength. "You should have stayed inside," he whispered. His voice cracked with a mixture of relief and raw, unadulterated fear for her safety. "I told you," she whispered back, resting her hands on his broad back. "I am not going anywhere. I look like a woman who has a kingdom to save," she finished for him, offering a small, soft smile that reached her eyes. As they neared the township, Thea shifted. The townspeople, Morches, and the Storrents was friend, their eyes wide with confusion and, in some cases, thin-veiled contempt. They were accustomed to the sight of Thaddeus, the mountain man who had been broken by grief and neglect. But they were not prepared for the sight of him sitting upright, proud, and ample woman who walked, with the poise of a queen in the making. They pulled up to the merchant's warehouse, but Beatrice steered him past the familiar, predatory grin of the man who'd been sabotaging their accounts. She directed him instead toward the specialized mill at the edge of the market, a place known for demanding only the highest grade of wool. Thaddeus trusted her implicitly, his hand never straying from her arm as they navigated the throng of curious onlookers. When they opened the back of the wagon, the mill owner, a man of meticulous habit, approached with a scowl, clearly expecting a haul of tangled, burr-filled fleece. He stopped, his jaw dropping. As he touched the wool Beatrice had spent hours cleaning and sorting. It was pristine, the fibers long, soft, and remarkably free of the debris that usually plagued the valley's local trade. "Where did this come from?" the man asked, his scowl replaced by a look of professional disbelief. "From our ranch," Thaddeus said, his voice deep and resonant, holding the weight of a man who was no longer apologizing for his existence. "It is the start of a season of better work." The deal was struck with the hour. The payment far exceeded what the merchant for the entire season's yield. As they walked away from the mill, the heavy bag of coins in Thaddeus' hand, Beatrice felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. They had the funds to settle the interest. They had the evidence of their competence. But as they turned to leave the market, a man stepped out from the shadows of an alley, a man dressed in the crisp, cold attire of a city lawyer, his face familiar and nauseatingly smug. It was the man whose signature was on the bank notice. "The architect of her own past ruin. Is a shame," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he watched them, "that your victory here will be so short-lived. A payment to the bank is not payment to the truth." "Beatrice, do you really think you can hide forever?" Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face, her hand gripping Thaddeus's arm until her nails dug into his skin. Thaddeus turned, his eyes narrowing, his posture radiating a lethal tint that made the lawyer take an involuntary step back. But Beatrice saw something else. The man was not alone. Behind him, standing in the shadows of the carriage house, was a figure that made her world stop entirely, a person from her past, who held not just the secret of the fire, but a secret that threatened to tear her, Moen, and it was spoken aloud. What was the secret? And why did Beatrice realize that her love for Thaddeus might be the final weapon her enemy would use to destroy her? The figure emerging from the carriage house shadows was a man Beatrice had prayed never to see again, Thomas. The man had been her partner in the shop. The man she had believed was killed in the blaze. He stood leaning against the brickwork, his face marred by a jagged scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent, mocking sneer. The sight of him turned Beatrice blood ice. She had lived with the guilt of his supposed death for years. And now, he stood here, a living ghost draped in the same expensive cloth as the lawyer. Thaddeus felt the jolt of her body against his. He did not ask for explanations. He simply stepped forward, positioning him as a wall between Beatrice and the man who was clearly the source of her deepest trauma. Thaddeus's presence was a dark, towering storm, his hand dropping to his side where his heavy work fought holstered. "You have problem with my wife?" Thaddeus asked. His voice, so quiet it carried a more terrifying weight than a shout. Thomas chuckled, the sound thin and strained. "Your wife? I think you have been deceived. Mountain Man. Beatrice is not a wife. She is a fugitive. She is the one who left me die in that fire. The one who took the ledgers and fled so she could sell the secret of my banquet to the highest bidder." The lie was so audacious that Beatrice felt a dizzying wave of nausea. She tried to speak, but her voice failed her. Thaddeus, however, did not waver. He turned his head slightly. His eyes never leave the man in the shadows. "I do not care what you claim she did," Thaddeus said, his voice flat and devoid of interest in the man's version of the past. "I care about the woman who stood by me when I had nothing. The woman who worked until her hands bled to save a home that was not hers. You are a ghost. And in this valley, we bury our ghosts." He took Beatrice's hand, his grip firm and anchoring, and began to walk. The lawyer and Thomas stood frozen, clearly stunned by the refusal of the mountain man to engage in their drama of accusation. But as they neared the wagon, Thomas called out, his voice with a final, desperate venom, "She will kill you, Thaddeus. She is a fire that consumes everything she touches. The moment you feel safe, she will burn you, just like she burned us." Beatrice reached the wagon, her entire body shaking, but she did not look back. Thaddeus helped her on the bench, his movements slow and deliberate, and then climbed up beside her. He took the reins, his jaw set in a line of immovable granite. He drove them out of the town and back toward the open, rolling plains, the silence between them thick and suffocating. As the town faded in the distance, Beatrice finally found the strength to speak. "He is lying," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clatter of the wheels. "He was the one who set the fire to collect the insurance. I ran because I knew would kill me if I told the truth. I fled 'cause I knew he was still alive and coming. Callahan, actually." Thaddeus continued to drive, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. For a long, agonizing mile, he did not speak, and Beatrice felt the familiar, crushing weight of isolation beginning to settle in her chest. She had finally brought the chaos of her past to his door, and she knew that, like his life de Herner, her toivon known. Trying, or she worked with a frantic, rhythmic intensity, her lungs burning with the acrid smoke, her heart pounding a desperate rhythm of defiance. She saw Thaddeus through the haze, his figure of unstoppable force. He had tackled one of the riders from his horse, the two men rolling in the dust. He fought with the raw, uncompromising power of a man who was defending not just his property, but the only person who had ever truly seen him. "You have no right," the leader of the riders shouted, his voice cracking as he scrambled to pull a pistol from his holster. Thaddeus didn't answer. He simply rose like a titan, his massive hand closing around the leader's wrist. The sound of the man's gasp loud in the sudden, eerie quiet as the wind shifted. The fire roared, a hungry, living thing. But Thaddeus seemed oblivious to the heat. His focus centered entirely on the man who had brought the destruction to his door. "This is not a bank claim," Thaddeus growled, his voice a low, terrifying raps that carried over the crackle of the flames. "This is a crime, and you will be the one to pay for it." Beatrice managed to the last of the flames on the porch. Her hands blistered and raw. She turned and saw the other riders fleeing, their nerve broken by sight of their leader being had to live the wilderness to exact a final Kala Ur Khan. Terrible justice. She moved toward Thaddeus, her breath hitching in her chest. Thaddeus. Stop, she cried down. If you kill him, you lose everything. You lose your life, your home, our future. He froze, his fist hovering over the man's face, his chest heaving. He looked at her, his eyes wide, bloodshot, and filled with a raw, agonizing conflict. He was a man who'd been pushed to the edge of his humanity, a man whose silence had been rewarded with the burning of his heart's refuge. He slowly lowered his hand, his grip loosening, and let the man slump in the dust. Thaddeus stood over him. Dwight, the violence he had been forced to contain. He looked at the barn, which was now a skeleton of glowing embers, then back at Beatrice. The expression on his face was one of absolute, shattering loss. Everything we built, he whispered, his voice cracking. It is gone. Beatrice. It is just ash again. Beatrice walked to him, ignoring the searing heat of the nearby ruins. She took his face in her hands, her fingers tracing the lines of ash and sweat on his skin. She looked into his eyes and saw the core loop his entire existence, the deep, bottomless fear that he was cursed to lose everything he ever loved. It was the same fear she carried since the day her own shop burned. The barn is gone, she said, her voice soft but immovable. But we are standing. The kingdom is not the wood, Thaddeus. It is the two of us. And we are not going anywhere. As the last of the flames died down to dull, pulsing red, they stood in the middle of their ruined yard, the silent, watching plains stretching out around them. But as they looked toward the house, they saw something that stopped their breath. In direction of the town, not with a torch or a weapon, but with a piece of paper that shimmered in the twilight. It was the sheriff, and behind him, a small procession of neighbors, their faces lit by a mixture of shock and, surprisingly, a tentative, yawning shame. The core loop of their survival was about to be addressed. But as the sheriff held out the paper, Beatrice realized that the town was not coming to arrest them. They were coming to bear, or truth histas. The sheriff stopped the edge of the bracken circle, the barnyard, that once been the barnyard, his badge catching the dying light of the sunset. He held the document out, his expression unreadable, though the men behind him shifted with uncomfortable, collective fidgeting. The air remained thick with the smell of scorched timber and damp earth, a graveyard of the labor Beatrice and Thaddeus had poured into their land. I did not come to collect on the debt, Thaddeus, the sheriff said, his voice unusually quiet. I came 'cause a rider reached town an hour ago, the man who claimed to be your brother. He was bragging in the saloon about his work here tonight. He did not realize that the law in this valley, while slow to wake, still has teeth. Beatrice held her breath as the sheriff stepped forward, his eyes traveling from the ruined barn to the couple standing in the center of the debris. He looked at Beatrice, and, for the first time, he did not see the drifter or the stranger. He saw a woman, tall amidst the ruins of her home, her apron scorched and her hand bandaged with strips of her own skirt. The bank manager has been arrested, the sheriff continued, his voice hardening. It turns out the records of your debt were falsified. The merchant associates bleeding this valley for years, using the bank as a cover to seize land and drive out homesteaders. The papers Silas the bankster for use against you, Prairie, were nothing but forgeries. The silence that followed was absolute. Thaddeus turned his gaze toward the ruins, his posture slowly losing its jagged, defensive edge. He looked at Beatrice, then back to the sheriff. The revelation hit them not as sudden joy, but as a wave of profound, weary vindication. The struggle that had nearly destroyed had been test of their failure, but a war against a darkness that had been feeding on the entire valley. "Why us now?" Thaddeus asked, his voice still low, but no longer vibrating with the threat of violence. "Because," one of the neighbors stepped forward, a man whose face Beatrice recognized from the market. "We watched you too. We watched you fight for this land when everyone else would have walked away. We saw the wool you brought to market, and we heard what that city lawyer was saying about you. We realized that if we let you be destroyed, we were next." Beatrice felt a swell of emotion that she had long ago locked away behind a wall of resignation. She had come here hoping to be invisible, hoping to disappear in the vastness of the mountains. But she had instead become the catalyst for a change that would outlast the fire. She looked at Thaddeus, and she saw the final, total dissolution of his stoicism. He reached out and took her hand, his palm rough and steady, and for the first time, he did not look away from the world. "The barn is gone," Thaddeus said, his voice echoing over the quiet yard. "But the land remains, and the town will help you rebuild," the sheriff replied, tipping his hat. "It is the least we can do for the people who expose the rot in our own house." As they began to move into the yard, bringing tools and supplies, Beatrice felt the final, lingering weight of her past, the fear of the fire, the shame of the fire, the cold isolation of the drifter evaporate in the cool night air. She realized that the core loop of her life, the constant fear of being destroyed by the very thing she tried to save, had finally been broken. She was no longer a woman defined by what she had lost. She was the architect of what they were about to build. Thaddeus squeezed her hand, a gesture of profound, wordless devotion. He was no longer the mountain man hiding from the world, and she was no longer the underdog seeking a place to disappear. They were the center of a new, burgeoning community, the heart of a beginning to take root in the soil they had defended with their very lives. But as the night worked by the light of a new, controlled bonfire, Beatrice stepped aside, finding a moment of solitude by the edge of the blackened barn site. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the charred remains of the ledgers she had saved. She had one last piece of the past to release, the proof that had haunted her for years. As she cast it in the fire, she watched the embers rise in the sky, a final, glowing testament to a life she was fully leaving behind. What did it feel like to watch the last of her past dissolve? And what would the morning light reveal now? That the threat of the bank, the merchant, and her own haunting memories had been effectively reduced to ash. The morn sun crested the mountains, bathing the ranch in a soft, golden glow that promised a new beginning. The air no longer smelled of acrid smoke, but of damp earth, blooming sage, and the promise of a long, productive summer. Beatrice stood on the porch, her hands resting comfortable on the wooden railing that had been reinforced overnight by the steady, industrious hands of the neighbors. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool mountain air fill her lungs, and she knew that the phantom weight she had carried for years was gone. Thaddeus stepped out from the house, his movements quiet and sure. He was no longer the kempt, haunting figure she had met weeks ago. He was a man who stood tall, his eyes clear and alight with a quiet, persistent joy. He walked to the porch and stood behind her, his large, call-used hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. The contact was not a request for support, but a declaration of partnership. "The neighbors are already at the site of the barn," he said, his voice a warm, steady rumble. "They brought timber from the valley. By the end of the week, we will have a structure twice the size of the last one." Beatrice leaned back into him, feeling the solid, unwavering strength of his frame. "We have a kingdom to build. Thaddeus. Real one. Not just for us, but for everyone who has learned that soil is worth defending." They stood together for a long time, watching the sun climb higher, the world stretching out before them like an open ledger. The journey had been long, marked by fires and ghosts and the crushing weight their own insecurities. But they had emerged on other side as something entirely new. The transformation of the farm was merely the mirror of the transformation within them. They had learned that the most profound come from the Quran does not come from forgetting the past, but from finding some brave enough to walk through the fire. Callahan. Their story was no longer one of survival, but one of belonging. Beatrice knew now that her size, her history, and her scars were not liabilities. They were the armor she forged to protect the compassionate heart she had refused to lose. And Thaddeus, the giant who had once been a wall of silence, had discovered that his true strength lay not in his ability to endure alone, but in his capacity to love and be loved in return. As the morning proceeded, they moved in the yard, greeted by the laughter of the neighbors and the clatter of tools. The ranch was a hub of purposeful activity, a place of life and restoration. The sheep were already grazing in the meadow, their bleating a sign of a future that was long threatened by delay. Beatrice felt a profound, quiet catharsis, an emotional resolution that settled into her bones like the warmth of the sun. She had found a home, not just in the landscape, but in the heart of a man who was as solid and reliable as the earth itself. In the days that followed, the Prairie Kingdom began to truly take shape. They cultivated the fields, they mended the fences, and they opened their home to a community that finally seen the truth of their character. They had earned their happiness through courage, forgiveness, and the stubborn refusal the darkness that had tried to claim them. Callahan. The lesson they left behind was simple, written in the very soil they tended, that no matter how dilapidated a life might seem, it always be redeemed through the quiet, consistent act of showing up for one another. As the sun began to set on that final day of the harvest preparation, Thaddeus took Beatrice's hand and led her to the ridge overlooked the valley. The sky was a brilliant, endless canvas of pink and gold, and, the first time, Beatrice realized she was not looking at the world as a place to hide. She was looking at it as a place to live. She looked at Thaddeus, his rugged, bearded face glowing in the evening light, and she knew that the journey they had traveled was only the first chapter of a life that would be defined, quiet beauty of their shared existence. They were home. They whole. And they were finally, at long last, exactly where they belonged. This story is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, locales, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. The emotional journey and character growth depicted are intended for entertainment purposes. Emphasized as themes of resilience, redemption, and the enduring power of human connection.